There is a reason today deserves your attention before the rest of this week unfolds, because not every day carries the same kind of pressure, invitation, or turning point. And this particular day is asking you to notice what is happening while it is still happening. Today is August 17th, 2026, and two of the five major events that define this important stretch are exact today. Out of the next 7 days, one date will require a very specific response from you, and the significance may not become obvious until you are standing directly inside the moment. This month contains 5 days that carry more concentrated meaning than the other 26 combined, and today is the first one. That difference is important because there is a huge gap between astrology that gives you a vague emotional description and astrology that gives you a specific date you can actually observe in your own life. When someone tells you that something may happen sometime this month, almost anything can be made to fit afterward. A particular day changes that completely. A dated event gives you something concrete to watch, something you can compare with your choices, conversations, reactions, and circumstances as they unfold in real time. This week is unusually specific because it contains 5 distinct astrological events, each arriving on a clearly identifiable day, and each carrying a different kind of emotional or practical request. I am going to move through them in the exact sequence in which they occur, and then look at what follows immediately afterward as the week comes toward its close. The first major influence is Mercury meeting Saturn today, bringing attention toward an actual decision and making it harder to remain suspended between possibilities forever. At the same time, Venus meets Jupiter today, creating an opening around something beneficial that may require you to stop questioning whether you are allowed to receive it. Then Mars remains in conflict with Neptune for 4 consecutive days, creating a longer period in which you may need to separate what is genuinely true from what only feels convincing because emotions, expectations, or uncertainty have made the picture harder to see. On the 19th, the Moon reaches its first quarter in Scorpio, bringing something that has been concealed, avoided, or kept beneath the surface closer to direct awareness. Then, on the 21st, Venus faces Saturn directly, creating a test around what you are trying to preserve and whether the thing you are holding on to has enough strength and substance to remain in your life. As you listen, pay attention to which of these already resembles the emotional atmosphere of your last several days, because sometimes your own recent experience will tell you which part of the week is already beginning to speak through you. Sharing that in the comments can also reveal something interesting because when many people describe what they have been experiencing to repeating emotional patterns can sometimes show how a particular week has actually been felt in ordinary human life, beyond the technical language of astrology. And if you want to understand these movements before the events fully unfold, rather than searching for explanations afterward, staying with this kind of timing allows you to observe the sky while your own story is still developing. Before going deeper, there is one important boundary to keep in mind. None of these influences should be treated as an unavoidable promise, and none of them means that your life has been written in advance. A better way to approach what comes next is to imagine the astrology as information about conditions. A weather report does not force you to go outside, and it does not decide whether you will carry an umbrella. It simply tells you what the atmosphere may be like so you can respond with greater awareness. The same principle applies here. Now let us focus on what is exact today, because this is where the week begins to become especially practical. Mercury, associated with thought, communication, reasoning, writing, discussion, and the movement of ideas into words, forms a harmonious trine with Saturn today, the planet connected with structure, commitment, time, responsibility, and consequences that extend beyond the immediate moment. This is one of those alignments that can become extremely useful without making a dramatic entrance. It does not necessarily arrive with a crisis, an emotional explosion, or some unmistakable external event that forces everyone to pay attention. Instead, it can create a quieter sense that your thoughts have become more organized, your words have gained more authority, and something you've been considering can finally be approached with greater seriousness. That quiet quality is precisely what can make this influence easy to miss. Difficult aspects often demand attention because something feels uncomfortable enough that you cannot ignore it. A harmonious trine can operate differently. It may simply make an important task easier to handle, make a serious conversation more productive, or help an unfinished idea finally acquire enough structure to become actionable. Mercury describes the process through which something inside your mind becomes understandable to another person. It governs the sentence you choose, the message you send, the question you ask, the negotiation you enter, and the effort required to transform a thought that exists only internally into something that can function in the outside world. Saturn represents the part of life that asks whether that thought can survive reality. It deals with limits, responsibility, consistency, durability, and the consequences attached to choices that are meant to last. When Mercury and Saturn cooperate through a trine, there is an opportunity for the mind and the structure of life to work together instead of pulling in opposite directions. Thoughts that have been scattered can become more disciplined. Words that might normally come out uncertain can become more deliberate. A plan that once seemed like a collection of possibilities can begin to look like something with an actual framework. This is why today can be especially valuable if there is a decision you have postponed because you kept telling yourself that you needed more time, more information, or a better moment. Sometimes hesitation is not evidence that you are confused forever. Sometimes you have simply been waiting for your thoughts to become mature enough to support the responsibility that comes with acting on them. The influence available today supports that kind of maturity. If you had been standing at the edge of a long-term choice, repeatedly imagining both outcomes without allowing yourself to select one, this is the kind of moment that can help you move from mental repetition into deliberate commitment. The emphasis is not on rushing, it is on recognizing when enough clarity already exists to make a responsible choice. Career matters can respond particularly well to this combination because professional decisions often require two things at once: clear judgment and the willingness to follow through after the decision has been made. The same principle can apply to financial commitments, agreements, contracts, negotiations, and situations in which your words need to be supported by consistent action. Think about what this could look like in a completely ordinary moment of your day. Perhaps there is a conversation with your manager that you have rehearsed privately more times than you would admit. You know there is something important you need to discuss about your role, but each time you consider bringing it up, another reason appears to postpone the conversation. Maybe you have been trying to determine exactly how to explain what you want without sounding demanding, uncertain, emotional, or unprepared. You may have spent weeks carrying the conversation silently, changing the wording in your head, imagining possible reactions, and waiting for the perfect opening that never seems to arrive. Today, the value of Mercury and Saturn is that the conversation does not need to remain trapped inside your mind. The structure becomes available for the thought to become a real statement, and the responsibility of choosing your words can finally meet the clarity required to say what you actually mean. If there is one thing you should not underestimate about today, it is the difference between knowing what you need to do and finally becoming clear enough to do it. The Mercury-Saturn trine occurring today creates a supportive atmosphere for exactly that kind of moment, especially when the conversation or decision in front of you requires maturity, precision, and a willingness to stand behind your own words. This does not mean that the universe suddenly changes another person into someone more cooperative. It does not guarantee that your manager will immediately agree with you, that every negotiation will end in your favor, or that everyone around you will suddenly understand what you are trying to communicate. The real advantage is happening inside your own mind. Your thoughts can become more organized, less tangled, and easier to translate into language that another person can actually understand. When your thinking becomes structured, the quality of the conversation often improves naturally, regardless of the person sitting across from you. You may notice that something which has felt complicated for weeks suddenly becomes surprisingly simple when you finally say it out loud. You may realize that you are not actually lacking an answer. You are struggling to trust the answer you already had. That distinction matters. There is another way this energy can appear, and it may be much more ordinary than a major career discussion. Perhaps there is a financial issue you have repeatedly avoided because you already know that looking at the numbers will require you to make a serious adjustment. Maybe there is a long-term plan you have been imagining without ever giving it specific steps. You may have been thinking about moving, saving money, reorganizing your daily routine, or creating a different structure for your life, but keeping the idea vague has allowed you to avoid the emotional weight of making it real. Once something becomes specific, It also becomes a responsibility. That is where Saturn enters the picture. Saturn does not make permanence disappear. Instead, it can help you look directly at permanence without immediately feeling overwhelmed by it. There is a psychological difference between saying that you should probably change something someday and sitting down to determine exactly what needs to change, what it will require, and what you are genuinely prepared to commit to. Today supports the second approach. This is especially meaningful for the person who has been waiting for an internal signal that says, now you are finally ready. You may have told yourself that you will decide when you feel completely certain, when the fear disappears, when every possible consequence becomes obvious, or when you somehow receive an unmistakable sign that removes all doubt. But life rarely gives that kind of perfect certainty. Sometimes what looks like uncertainty is actually ordinary hesitation sitting on top of a decision you already understand. Saturn does not create confidence out of thin air. Instead, this alignment can make the mental noise quiet enough for you to recognize how much you already know. If you have repeatedly said to yourself that you will choose once you feel more certain, then today gives you an opportunity to examine that statement honestly. Ask yourself whether you truly need more information, or whether you are simply hoping that waiting longer will make the responsibility feel lighter. Those are not the same thing. Genuine uncertainty deserves patience. Fear disguised as uncertainty may simply be asking for permission to remain comfortable. At the same time, do not misunderstand the nature of this trine. Saturn is often associated with seriousness, limitation, responsibility, and discipline, so it can be tempting to assume that today requires you to make some painful sacrifice or force yourself into a decision simply because the astrology is supportive. That is not what this alignment is asking for. The harmony between Mercury and Saturn is valuable precisely because it offers steadiness without unnecessary pressure. If you examine the situation carefully and your honest conclusion is that you still need more time, then not yet can be a responsible answer. Saturn is not impressed by artificial urgency. It values appropriate timing, reality, consistency, and decisions that can actually be sustained. So if the answer is no, not yet, or I need more information, that answer can still come from the clarity this transit provides. The important thing is that you know why you are saying it. If you want to work with this energy intentionally, instead of allowing today to disappear into another ordinary Monday, give yourself even 20 minutes to focus on the decision, conversation, or responsibility you have been postponing. Do not try to make the exercise complicated. Put the thought into a stable form. Write down what you actually want. Write down what has been stopping you, and separate genuine obstacles from fears that have simply become familiar through repetition. A written plan, a list, a draft email, or a simple outline can be surprisingly powerful under a Mercury-Saturn trine because the act of placing thoughts into an organized structure mirrors the very quality this alignment supports. Something that has been moving endlessly through your mind becomes visible in front of you. Once you can see it, you can work with it. There is also a deeper layer here that has nothing to do with another person, a workplace, money, or an external decision. Some of the most important commitments made under this kind of influence are the promises you make privately to yourself. You may decide that a habit needs to change. You may finally commit to beginning something you have delayed. You may recognize that a boundary you have repeatedly announced to yourself needs to become something you actually practice. These internal commitments are not separate from Saturnian energy. They are one of its clearest expressions because Saturn is ultimately concerned with what remains true after the initial emotion has passed. Anyone can make a promise when motivation is high. The real test arrives later, when the excitement fades and the decision has to become part of ordinary life. That is why clarity today can matter beyond today. If you recognize that you want to live differently, the most meaningful action may not be dramatic at all. It may simply be choosing one structure that makes the new direction easier to maintain. This influence is strongest today and tomorrow, and it begins to loosen by Wednesday as Mercury moves forward toward other matters. If today becomes crowded and you do not manage to act immediately, tomorrow still carries meaningful residual clarity. But do not use that as a reason to postpone the recognition itself. Even naming the decision can change your relationship with it. Sometimes the first real movement does not come from taking action. It comes from admitting to yourself what the decision actually is. There is another reason this matters. Saturn does not measure the value of an intention by how sincere it sounded when you made it. Saturn measures it through what you continue doing afterward. If today gives you a decision, a commitment, or a plan, the deepest value of this alignment will not necessarily be visible during the moment when you choose. It will reveal itself through the weeks that follow, when daily life gives you countless opportunities either to honor that choice or quietly abandon it. Think of today as placing something into the ground. The planting itself may take only a moment, but what happens afterward determines whether anything meaningful develops from it. The sky can help you recognize the seed, but your later choices determine whether you continue tending it. And while Mercury and Saturn are helping you bring something into focus through responsibility and clear thinking, another exact influence is unfolding at the same time, and its tone is remarkably different. Venus meeting Jupiter today brings a softer kind of opportunity, one that is less concerned with deciding what must be carried and more concerned with recognizing what is already available to receive. Today carries a very different kind of invitation because, while one part of the sky is helping you become more serious and decisive, another is creating room for pleasure, connection, financial ease, attraction, and possibility to move with much less resistance than you may be accustomed to. Venus and Jupiter are meeting through a sextile today, and the atmosphere created by this contact is notably gentle compared with the pressure that often accompanies more difficult planetary relationships. Instead of feeling as though you have to fight your way towards something, you may notice that certain experiences become easier simply because you're willing to participate in them. This distinction is important. A trine tends to create a current that carries you without requiring much conscious effort, while a sextile is more like an invitation placed directly within your reach. The opportunity is there, the circumstances may be unusually supportive, but you still have to extend your hand. You still have to answer the invitation. Venus represents the things you value, the experiences that attract you, your relationship with beauty, affection, connection, pleasure, and money. Jupiter expands whatever it touches, bringing themes of growth, optimism, possibility, confidence, and the willingness to believe that life may have more available than what you have already experienced. When these two energies cooperate through a sextile, the result can feel like the world has become slightly more generous around the edges. You may find yourself more willing to ask for something, more comfortable allowing another person to come closer, or less burdened by the belief that every good thing must first be earned through exhaustion. The opportunity may not arrive wearing a dramatic label. In fact, it may be so ordinary that you almost overlook it. Someone says something kind about you. An invitation appears. A financial situation becomes easier than expected. Someone offers assistance without being asked. A conversation feels warmer than you anticipated. A door that you assumed would require effort opens with surprisingly little resistance. These small moments matter because they challenge a psychological pattern that many people carry without realizing it. When you have spent enough time believing that struggle is the price of anything valuable, ease can feel suspicious. You may receive something good and immediately begin searching for the hidden condition attached to it. You may hear a sincere compliment and instinctively reject it. You may be offered an opportunity and start wondering what the other person wants from you. You may experience financial relief and immediately prepare yourself for the next problem instead of allowing yourself to feel relief. That reaction is not necessarily because you do not want good things. Sometimes it is because your nervous system has become more familiar with protection than receiving. Venus and Jupiter together provide a chance to notice that pattern without turning it into another problem you need to solve. If something pleasant arrives today, try not to diminish it simply because it came easily. Let the compliment remain a compliment. Let the kindness remain kindness. Let the invitation be an invitation. Let the unexpected financial ease be a moment of relief without immediately forcing yourself to search for a negative explanation. There is a quiet lesson in this kind of day. Receiving is also a form of participation. You do not have to create every good experience through force. Sometimes the more difficult practice is allowing something beneficial to reach you without immediately questioning whether you deserve it. This becomes especially meaningful in relationships. Venus and Jupiter favor warmth rather than emotional intensity, so if you are already in a relationship, the most useful expression of this energy does not need to be dramatic. It may simply be telling someone something sincere that you appreciate about them. It may be offering an unexpected kindness. It may be choosing to enjoy someone's presence without turning the time together into another task that has to accomplish something. There can be value in simply allowing affection to exist without demanding that it prove anything. If you are single, this combination can create conditions that make connection feel easier and more natural. You could have a conversation that unexpectedly continues longer than planned. You might encounter someone who captures your attention without the interaction feeling forced. A simple exchange could leave you thinking about a person after the moment has passed. None of this should be interpreted as a promise that romance must appear today. The more useful interpretation is that openness is supported, and openness is one of the conditions that allows meaningful connection to develop in the first place. You cannot guarantee that another person will become important to you, but you can become more available to genuine interaction. Financial matters also receive an interesting layer of support because this Venus-Jupiter influence is occurring alongside today's Mercury-Saturn trine. Mercury and Saturn provide the disciplined side of the equation. They help you think carefully, calculate, organize, negotiate, and make decisions that can withstand time. Venus and Jupiter soften the emotional experience surrounding those decisions. Instead of approaching a serious financial choice as though it automatically means deprivation, you may be able to see it as a movement towards something more sustainable. A payment may be smaller than expected, a refund may appear, some unexpected income may provide breathing room. Even if the financial event itself is modest, the psychological effect can be meaningful because relief changes how you evaluate your options. A decision that previously felt like a painful sacrifice may suddenly look more like a practical step towards stability. There are certain signs that may notice this influence with particular clarity. Taurus and Libra, both connected with Venus, may experience the theme through a series of small conveniences, pleasant interactions, or moments of ease that seem to accumulate throughout the day rather than arriving as one enormous event. Sagittarius and Pisces, connected with Jupiter, may experience the shift more internally. Instead of one obvious external occurrence, there may be a noticeable return of optimism, confidence, or emotional spaciousness after a period in which life has felt smaller, heavier, or more restrictive than usual. For everyone else, the influence may be quieter, but quieter does not mean irrelevant. You might simply notice that a meal turns out better than expected, that a conversation moves naturally, or that a small act of generosity changes the emotional tone of an otherwise ordinary day. These are the kinds of moments worth observing without demanding that they become something larger. If you want to participate consciously rather than sitting back and waiting for the universe to demonstrate the transit to you, consider making one small intentional gesture of generosity today. It does not need to be expensive, dramatic, or performative. The point is to participate in the exchange of giving and receiving that Venus and Jupiter naturally emphasize. You may discover that the real shift is not simply what comes toward you, but how willing you are to recognize it when it arrives. Do not assume that generosity only matters when you have a reason to give, because under the Venus-Jupiter influence active now, the quality of the intention behind your action matters just as much as the action itself. When you offer something from sincere warmth rather than obligation, you participate in the kind of reciprocal movement that astrologers have long associated with Venus. Jupiter days. The return does not have to come from the same person, and it does not have to arrive as money, affection, or a favor that looks identical to what you gave. The deeper principle is that abundance tends to remain in motion when you respond to it with openness instead of fear. This is one reason a small act of generosity can feel surprisingly meaningful under this influence. You are not giving because you are afraid that refusing will bring bad luck. You are giving because you recognize that something is already moving through your life, and you are willing to let that movement continue. There is another layer to today that becomes especially important when you place the Venus-Jupiter influence beside the Mercury-Saturn trine happening at the same time. These two energies create a combination that is unusually useful because they support different sides of the same human experience. Mercury, Saturn can help you organize your thoughts, speak with maturity, and finally put serious intentions into words. Venus, Jupiter can make you more receptive to whatever comes back after you speak. That means today is not only about finding the courage to ask for something. It is also about having enough emotional openness to hear the answer without immediately becoming defensive, frightened, disappointed, or suspicious. Imagine that you have been carrying a request inside yourself for a long time. You know you need to ask for something, but you have delayed because you have been imagining every possible negative response. You may have rehearsed the conversation repeatedly, wondering whether you will be rejected, misunderstood, judged, or told no. Today offers a different possibility. Mercury, Saturn can help you formulate the request clearly, while Venus, Jupiter can help you remain open to whatever response follows. That combination is valuable because courage without receptivity can become force, while receptivity without courage can become passivity. Today allows both qualities to exist together. If you have been waiting for a moment when your thoughts are organized enough to speak and your heart is open enough to receive the outcome, this is one of the more supportive windows for that experience. The Venus-Jupiter influence remains active through the 19th, so today is not the only opportunity available to you. But today stands out because the alignment is reaching its exact point rather than simply existing within a wider range of influence. That makes the present moment particularly clear for observing how this energy interacts with your choices, your relationships, your finances, and your willingness to receive what life places in front of you. While Mercury and Venus are creating clarity and softness, another planetary combination is moving through a much less certain emotional landscape. Mars is forming a square with Neptune from the 17th through the 20th, and this changes the atmosphere considerably. Instead of making everything easier to understand, this influence can make action itself feel uncertain. Mars represents movement, desire, initiative, willpower, assertion, and the instinct that says, "I want this, so I am going to move toward it." Neptune operates very differently. Neptune dissolves edges, weakens certainty, blurs distinctions, and creates a space where reality, imagination, expectation, longing, and intuition can become difficult to separate. When Mars encounters Neptune through a square, the result can feel less like an obvious argument and more like trying to move through an environment where the resistance has no visible shape. You may put tremendous effort into something and wonder why you are getting nowhere. You may feel yourself pushing harder and harder without being able to identify what exactly is pushing back. There may be no obvious person standing in your way, no clear external problem that explains the frustration. Instead, your energy seems to disappear into uncertainty. That is what makes this period particularly disorienting. You can feel motivated without understanding the true source of that motivation. Or you can wake up expecting yourself to be energetic and discover that your usual drive has somehow vanished. Both experiences can belong to the same planetary tension. The important question is not simply whether you feel motivated, it is whether the motivation is connected to something real and clearly understood. This is where discernment becomes more valuable than speed. During a Mars-Neptune square, the temptation can be to interpret urgency as evidence that action is required. You may think that because something feels emotionally powerful, it must therefore be true. But intensity and truth are not always the same thing. Neptune can make an imagined possibility feel completely convincing, especially when it touches a hope, fear, fantasy, or emotional need that already exists inside you. Something may appear to be an unmistakable realization in the moment, only to look completely different several days later when the fog has lifted. That is why patience becomes such an important practical response during this period. If a decision can genuinely wait, allowing it to breathe for a few days may reveal information that is impossible to access while you are emotionally immersed in the uncertainty. This does not mean that every instinct is wrong, and it does not mean that you should distrust everything you feel. It means that you should give important choices enough time to distinguish intuition from impulse and genuine insight from temporary emotional intensity. Communication can also become complicated under this influence because Mars-Neptune does not only affect the way you understand yourself, it can also affect how other people understand themselves. Someone may tell you something that sounds confusing, contradictory, or incomplete. Their words and behavior may not seem to line up. Your first instinct might be to assume that they are intentionally hiding something from you, and sometimes that possibility may exist, but this transit does not automatically mean deception. Another person may simply be struggling with the same lack of clarity that you are experiencing. They may not fully understand what they want yet. They may speak from one emotional state and act from another. They may genuinely believe what they are saying in one moment, and then discover later that their feelings have shifted. The healthiest response is to observe the inconsistency without immediately creating a story around it. Notice the gap. Let time provide additional information. You do not have to fill every blank space with an explanation. That lesson can be difficult for people who are uncomfortable with uncertainty because the mind naturally wants closure. When something does not make sense, the brain often creates a narrative simply to stop the discomfort of not knowing. Mars-Neptune asks you to resist that reflex. Allow what is unclear to remain unclear until there is enough evidence to understand it. There is also a physical side to this period that deserves attention. Many people experience a distinctive kind of fatigue during Mars-Neptune squares, and it can feel different from ordinary tiredness. You may not have done very much physically and still feel as though your energy has been drained. You may begin the day with plans and discover that your capacity seems to disappear faster than expected. Instead of automatically judging yourself for this, consider the possibility that your body is signaling that your normal level of output is not appropriate for the current condition. Neptune is associated with softened boundaries, and that can include becoming more receptive to emotional atmospheres around you. You may absorb another person's stress without realizing that it does not actually belong to you. You may enter a room feeling fine and leave feeling exhausted because you unconsciously picked up the tension, anxiety, or emotional weight carried by someone else. This can be especially difficult when you are accustomed to pushing through discomfort and calling it discipline. During this particular stretch, rest can be a form of discernment rather than avoidance. If your body repeatedly asks you to slow down, treating that signal seriously may help you distinguish your own energy from the emotional residue you have taken on from your surroundings. You do not need to prove your strength by forcing yourself through every moment of exhaustion. The wiser response during a Mars-Neptune square is often to pause, observe, and allow the picture to become clearer before deciding what deserves your energy. This is the part of the week where the lesson changes from making the right move to recognizing when a move should wait. And that distinction becomes even more important as the hidden emotional material of the week begins moving closer to the surface. Discernment becomes meaningful only when you can recognize what it looks like while you are actually living through uncertainty. And this week gives you a very practical way to tell the difference between a grounded inner signal and a feeling created by confusion. Before you act on an intense reaction, pause and ask yourself whether you could explain exactly where that reaction came from in one clear sentence. If you can say, "I am uncomfortable with this agreement because the contract terms were changed twice and nobody explained why," then your feeling has a concrete foundation. There is something observable beneath the emotion, and that gives you a reason to investigate further. But if you keep trying to explain the feeling and every explanation becomes broader, more complicated, or impossible to pin down, then you may be dealing with something very different. If all you can honestly say is, "Something feels wrong and I cannot explain what it is," that does not automatically mean the feeling is false. It simply means that this particular period is not especially reliable for turning an unexplained feeling into an immediate decision. Intuition can absolutely exist before language catches up with it. Sometimes you sense a shift long before you can explain the evidence behind it. The point is not to reject that inner awareness. The point is to understand that with Neptune strongly involved this week, confusion can imitate intuition with remarkable convincing power. A vague feeling can feel profound simply because you cannot explain it. A sudden emotional certainty can feel like revelation even when it is actually fear, hope, projection, or exhaustion, wearing the appearance of certainty. That is why time becomes more valuable than immediate instinct during these next several days. If something feels slightly wrong, you do not have to force yourself to resolve it immediately. You can notice the feeling, record what you observed, and allow circumstances to reveal whether the feeling was pointing toward something real. Neptune rarely responds well to being demanded into clarity. The more aggressively you try to force an answer from an unclear situation, the more likely you are to create an explanation simply because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. There is a difference between honoring your instincts and obeying every unexplained emotion. This week asks you to honor the signal while delaying the verdict. If the feeling is based on something real, additional time will usually give you more evidence. If it was created primarily by confusion, fear, or projection, the passage of time may weaken it. The Mars-Neptune square begins easing after the 20th, and by the following weekend many people may notice that this particular atmosphere has lifted noticeably, even if the clarity is not yet complete. But before that fog fully clears, another lunar event arrives directly inside the middle of this uncertain period, and it may become the most revealing moment of the entire week. The first quarter moon in Scorpio on the 19th deserves special attention because it brings a completely different quality into the emotional landscape. Scorpio is not interested in staying at the surface of an experience. It naturally moves toward what has been concealed, avoided, suppressed, or left unnamed. This makes the first quarter moon in Scorpio arguably the strongest single moment of the week for an emotional breakthrough. Something that has been quietly developing beneath your ordinary awareness may become much harder to ignore. It could be a secret you have been carrying, a pattern you have noticed without fully admitting that you noticed it, or a realization that you have repeatedly pushed away because acknowledging it would require you to see a situation differently. The moon does not necessarily create the hidden material that appears under this influence. Rather, it can reduce the emotional distance that has allowed you to avoid looking directly at what was already there. To understand why the 19th carries such weight, it helps to understand the meaning of the first quarter phase itself. Astronomically, the moon moves through its cycle in approximately 29.5 days, traveling from the new moon toward the full moon, and then continuing through the remainder of the cycle before beginning again. The first quarter, also commonly described as the half moon, because approximately half of the lunar surface appears illuminated from Earth, occurs roughly 1 week after the new moon. Symbolically, this is the point where whatever intention was established around the new moon encounters its first serious test in the real world. Astrologers have historically described the first quarter as a crisis point. But crisis in this context does not necessarily mean disaster. The older meaning is closer to a decisive moment, a point at which something has to move in one direction or another. It resembles the older medical use of the word, when a critical stage in an illness could indicate that the body was approaching a decisive change, such as a fever breaking. The significance comes from the turning point, not from the assumption that something terrible must happen. When this particular first quarter takes place in Scorpio, that turning point becomes deeply emotional and psychologically revealing. Scorpio is associated with transformation, depth, and the willingness to confront material that other parts of the personality might prefer to keep hidden. This energy does not tend to settle for the polite version of a question. It wants to know what is underneath the first answer. Instead of simply asking whether you are upset about something, Scorpio energy pushes toward the deeper question of what you believe that situation means about you. That can be uncomfortable, because the surface explanation is often much easier to live with. You may say that you are frustrated with someone when underneath the frustration there is fear of rejection. You may say that you are dissatisfied with your career when beneath that dissatisfaction there is a deeper concern about whether you are living up to your own expectations. You may say that you are tired of a relationship when underneath the exhaustion there is resentment, longing, insecurity, or fear that you have not wanted to acknowledge. The Scorpio moon can bring those deeper layers closer to conscious awareness. On the 19th, this may appear as something that has been quietly accumulating for weeks, or perhaps even longer, suddenly becoming impossible to dismiss. It could involve a relationship pattern that you have noticed repeatedly but never named. It could involve a professional environment where your instincts have been telling you that something is not quite right, even though you have never been able to explain precisely what the problem is. It could also be entirely internal, such as an insecurity you thought you had moved beyond, resentment you did not want to admit, or longing that you kept pushing into the background because acknowledging it would make the rest of the situation more complicated. The important point is that the moon in Scorpio does not necessarily invent a new problem. It can simply remove some of the emotional insulation that has allowed you to remain comfortable without confronting an existing truth. This becomes particularly interesting because Mars is still moving through its square with Neptune at the same time. You may therefore experience something that initially seems contradictory. The overall week can feel unclear, while one specific realization becomes remarkably sharp. You could feel uncertain about many areas of your life, and yet suddenly understand one particular situation with a level of precision that surprises you. That contrast is worth respecting. If something becomes unmistakably clear on the 19th, while almost everything else continues to feel uncertain, Do not dismiss that clarity simply because the larger atmosphere remains confusing. The fact that one truth can cut through the surrounding fog may be exactly what makes it important. You do not need to solve every mystery at once. You may only need to notice the one thing that suddenly refuses to remain hidden. The body can also become part of this experience because emotional material does not always announce itself through a conscious thought first. Around the night of the 18th, moving into the 19th, some people associate Scorpio lunar energy with unusually vivid or intensified dreams, including dreams that may feel unsettling or emotionally charged. You may wake from a dream carrying a feeling that stays with you long after the details begin to disappear. You may also notice physical sensations such as tightness around the chest or throat, sensations that many people associate with holding back words or emotions that had not yet been expressed. These experiences can occur alongside the emotional symbolism of the transit, but they should not automatically be treated as something alarming simply because they appear around this date. What matters most is the pattern of awareness. Something may be asking to be acknowledged, and the value of this lunar moment is not necessarily in forcing an immediate answer, but in recognizing what has been waiting underneath the surface while the rest of the week has been covered in fog. And once that hidden layer begins to reveal itself, the final major relationship test of the week becomes much easier to understand, because what you are willing to hold on to will soon have to prove whether it can actually withstand reality. The revelation itself is only the beginning, because what you choose to do after something hidden finally becomes visible will determine whether that awareness changes your life or simply becomes another emotional moment that passes without resolution. Scorpio energy can be extremely powerful, but power without conscious direction can easily move toward two extremes. You may suddenly confront everything at once, speak from accumulated emotion, and turn a necessary truth into an explosive confrontation. Or you may experience the realization, feel uncomfortable with what it reveals, and immediately push it back into the background because pretending nothing happened feels easier than dealing with what you now know. Neither response creates genuine resolution. The more mature expression of this Scorpio influence sits directly between those reactions. It asks you to identify what has appeared with precision, without exaggerating it, and without minimizing it. You might write it down privately if you are not ready to speak with another person. You might eventually explain it directly to the person involved. The essential step is that you stop allowing the newly revealed truth to remain vague. When something has been operating in the background of your life without a name, it can influence your choices without you fully realizing it. Once you give it a clear name, you gain the ability to decide what happens next. Suppose the realization involves a relationship. The appearance of an uncomfortable truth does not automatically mean that the relationship itself is unhealthy or destined to end. Sometimes the relationship is not the actual problem. Sometimes the problem is simply that an important conversation has been postponed for too long. You may have known that something needed to be discussed, but continued choosing temporary peace over lasting clarity. Perhaps you avoided mentioning a recurring behavior because you did not want to create tension. Perhaps you accepted an arrangement that no longer felt fair because changing it seemed more difficult than tolerating it. Perhaps you kept telling yourself that the issue was not important enough to bring up, even though some part of you continued returning to it. The Scorpio moon can make that strategy harder to maintain, because the emotional cost of avoidance begins to become more obvious than the discomfort of honesty. That does not mean you need to confront someone impulsively on the 19th. It means you may finally understand what the conversation needs to be about. If what emerges is entirely internal, the same principle applies. Maybe you recognize a belief about yourself that has quietly influenced your decisions for years. Maybe you notice a fear that has been determining what you allow yourself to pursue. Maybe you discover resentment, insecurity, or longing that you have kept outside conscious attention because acknowledging it would require you to reconsider the way you have been living. Naming the experience does not make it disappear, but it can weaken the unconscious control it has held over you. A feeling that remains unnamed can quietly steer your behavior from the background. A feeling that has been clearly identified can finally become something you observe, understand, and eventually choose how to respond to. The first quarter moon in Scorpio is strongest on the 19th, but its emotional material does not necessarily disappear when the lunar phase moves forward. What surfaces may continue developing into a clearer understanding during the following day or two. Give yourself space through the 20th and 21st to process what you have recognized, instead of demanding that every realization become a complete answer immediately. Sometimes the most important breakthrough is not the final conclusion. It is the moment when you can no longer honestly pretend that you did not see what you saw. Then, 2 days after the Scorpio moon reaches this critical point, Venus moves into direct opposition with Saturn on the 21st, and this brings the focus from hidden emotional truth toward the actual strength of attachment and commitment. This aspect is frequently described in frightening terms, especially when relationship astrology turns every Venus-Saturn contact into a prediction of heartbreak. That interpretation is far too narrow. Venus opposite Saturn is better understood as a test of substance. It asks whether something you care about has enough reality, honesty, structure, and endurance to support the emotional weight you are placing on it. An opposition creates a different kind of experience from a square or a trine. A square tends to generate friction within the situation, while an opposition often makes the tension visible through two contrasting sides and frequently through another person. Because Venus is associated with affection, attraction, connection, values, and the bonds we form with others, this opposition can become especially noticeable through relationships. That relationship could involve a romantic partner, a close friend, or even a business connection. Saturn then introduces the questions that time eventually asks of every attachment. Can this connection withstand responsibility? Can it survive honesty? Can both people carry their share of the weight? Is the bond supported by something deeper than convenience, attraction, novelty, or habit? This is the part of the transit that deserves to be understood without fear. Venus represents the experience of affection and desire, the part of connection that can feel natural and effortless when something is new or exciting. Saturn represents reality, duration, responsibility, consequence, and the aspects of a connection that become visible only after the initial ease has been tested by ordinary life. When these two stand opposite one another on the 21st, the relationship or commitment involved can become a mirror. It may reveal which parts of the connection were built primarily on attraction and which parts have enough structure to continue carrying real emotional weight over time. If a relationship has been operating on unspoken tension, this can become especially noticeable. Maybe there is an old disagreement that both people politely avoid. Maybe one person has an expectation that was never clearly communicated. Maybe resentment has been accumulating quietly because neither side wanted to risk an uncomfortable conversation. These things can become harder to keep beneath the surface around the 21st. Saturn is not necessarily trying to punish anyone. Its function is much more practical. It makes the consequences of continued avoidance easier to recognize. A relationship that has been honest and structurally sound may experience the same transit very differently. If two people have already learned how to discuss difficult subjects, acknowledge limitations, respect boundaries, and remain truthful even when the truth is uncomfortable, Venus opposite Saturn can actually strengthen confidence in what they have built. The pressure does not necessarily break something that is solid. Sometimes pressure reveals that it was solid all along. This is why the transit should not be approached as a countdown to loss. It is more accurately a period of verification. Something may become more serious because both people recognize its value and are willing to take responsibility for maintaining it. Something else may weaken because the connection was relying on convenience or wishful thinking instead of genuine foundation. Taurus and Libra may experience this Venus-ruled transit particularly clearly, often through one specific relationship or attachment, rather than through a general emotional atmosphere. Capricorn and Aquarius, connected with Saturn, may experience the same energy more internally as a growing demand to become honest with themselves about the actual condition of a connection rather than waiting for another person to force the issue. Everyone else can still encounter the theme through relationships, friendships, partnerships, or personal attachments, although the expression may be less dramatic. You may have a conversation that feels more serious than expected. You may finally need to state a boundary that you have postponed stating. You may simply look at a relationship with unusually sober eyes and recognize where reality ends and wishful thinking begins. And this does not apply only to romance. A business partnership can face the same examination. A close friendship can reveal whether mutual care is supported by mutual responsibility. Even your relationship with your own creative work or your own self-image can enter this kind of evaluation when attachment exists without complete honesty about what supports it. Anywhere Venusian attachment exists without enough Saturnian structure, the 21st can bring pressure toward greater truth. If you already feel nervous about this date, do not immediately assume that the anxiety means something bad is coming. Instead, let the anxiety become a question. Is there a conversation you have been postponing because some part of you already suspects what the answer might be? Is there a relationship you are trying to preserve without admitting what has actually changed? Are you holding on to something because it is genuinely valuable, or because releasing it would force you to accept a reality you have been avoiding? The week does not manufacture these questions, it simply makes them harder to ignore. Some connections may end around moments like this because they were never supported by enough substance to withstand honest examination. Other connections may become stronger because they finally prove that they can survive a period of pressure without collapsing. The best preparation for the 21st is therefore not fear and not emotional defensiveness. It is honesty practiced before the test arrives. Look at the foundation of the connection now. Acknowledge what you genuinely know rather than what you hope is true. Then Saturn has less power to surprise you because you have already begun asking yourself the question it is bringing forward. That completes the larger sequence of the week. Mercury and Saturn bring you toward a decision. Venus and Jupiter open a space where something beneficial can be received. Mars and Neptune challenge you to distinguish reality from confusion. The Scorpio first quarter moon brings hidden emotional material into awareness and asks you to transform your relationship with what you discover. Then Venus meeting Saturn asks whether the commitments and connections you value can withstand the weight of reality. Immediately afterward, on the 22nd, the Sun crosses into Virgo, bringing this entire sequence toward a more grounded and practical atmosphere. The emphasis shifts toward new routines, health, organization, and the quiet work of building something tangible from whatever the previous days have revealed. What you discover is not meant to remain an interesting emotional experience. It becomes material you can use. So pay attention to which of these 5 movements feels most connected to what you have already been experiencing, and which one you still feel yourself resisting. The pattern may become clearer as the week progresses. If this way of understanding astrology through mechanism first and mysticism second helps you recognize your own experience more clearly, stay connected for the next cycle so you can observe the sky before the events unfold, rather than searching for an explanation only after everything has already happened. And if this week has felt unusually intense, remember that the intensity is not necessarily one single event. It is the accumulation of different planetary questions arriving in sequence, each asking you to notice something different about decisions, receiving, discernment, hidden emotion, and genuine commitment.